All right, so for today, we are covering Book 2 of Augustine's Confessions. How did the reading go?
Oh, it was much easier than the first book.
You thought it was much easier. In what sense? What way?
It was based more on theology, which I know more about, and it wasn't jumping around being somewhat of a talking about qualities of God and then his autobiography and then just later points in the introduction. It was more just chaptered on what he thought sin was.
All right, so this is primarily narrative instead of this pseudo-theological prayer that just jumps around with a bunch of other related theological topics. There is some interesting theology and philosophy in Book 2 concerning free will and the nature of sin and sinfulness. But it folds right in very naturally. So, yeah, okay, that's a sensible reaction. Yes?
I like the bit where he clarified that he wasn't writing this. He clarified it was for the readers of it to understand and to find faith rather than, because it is written in that prayer format where it's addressed to God, but he did clarify that it is for the reader.
Good. So, and that's one of the reasons we consider it an autobiography is a lot of it very clearly is to his audience. And in fact, not only is it for his human audience, but in historical context, there are almost certainly political goals behind him writing this. In short, he needs to justify his existence in having a position of power in the church, given his past reputation, given that he already has a son, given that he was associated with this rival religion for a decade. So yeah, he's got some political goals he has to accomplish here. So I think that is right. So he definitely has a human audience, despite the fact that it is framed as a prayer towards God. How about questions? What thoughts? What thoughts do you have about it, or what questions do you have? What might we clarify? Now, forgive me. How do you like to be addressed?
Demi's fine.
Demi?
Yes.
All right, Demi. Tell us your question or observation.
So it was interesting when he was talking about death and how he said he was just stealing just to steal what he didn't really have. Like the pairs that he stole, he had better pairs initially. He just wanted just the thrill, I guess. Like he had no real motive other than the fact that he was sick.
Good. Yeah, the theft of the pairs is really interesting. On the one hand, it's kind of a stupid thing to obsess over. I mean, who in their teen years doesn't have something, just kind of silly that where you're like, well, what the hell was I thinking that weekend when I did this or that, got into this mischief or that mischief? And it's just kind of, on a certain sense, to anyone who's thought about it, it's really just a piece of teenage mischief. It's not the sort of thing that normal people obsess over. On the other hand, to use it as a paradigm example of the irrationality of sin, that's what he's doing there. He's trying to say, well, this was kind of a dumb thing to do. I mean, like, normal people might do something wrong, but there's always a rational motive behind it. Why did he steal the $100? Because I needed $100 because I wanted that extra spending power. But why would you steal something that was inferior to what you already had? And he actually hints at some point that this might be the worst category of sin, to do evil for its own sake. So we'll get into that. That's going to be a major topic today.
I was a bit confused it was on that same topic when he's referring to murder and the murderer who murders seemingly without reason. I was kind of, was he arguing that is a thing that you can do it without reason, or was he I think he was trying to clarify there was a reason.
Yeah, there was a reason. And first of all, the choice of the character there was very important. Let me remind myself. The person that he mentions there was the enemy of Cicero, who will turn out to be one of his heroes. Who was it that he cites a specific person he's talking about there? Do you remember which book that was from?
Book for chapter 5.
Chapter 5. Oh, yeah, okay. No, this isn't the part where he said, oh, yeah, there it is. At the bottom, so he says, would anybody commit murder for no reason? And if you read the very last line, he has Catiline in mind. Catiline was I believe he was an opponent of Cicero in the first century. And he's attributing sort of thuggish motives to Catiline. But the idea here is that nobody would commit murder for no reason. So why? So even if somebody seems to commit murder for no reason, think of a mafia hitman that might kill somebody. The rational motive might be here because he wants to stay good at it. So why were we violent? Well, I don't want to get rusty at it. I want to be good at it for when I need it. So like unlike his stealing of the pears, he wants to find a rational motive behind even things that appear irrational. Now, the funny thing about the theft of the pears, after obsessing about it for almost half of book 2, did you notice that he actually gives a rational explanation for why he stole the pears?
For the camaraderie of his friends.
Right, because he wanted to hang out with his friends, and that's what they were doing, and that's what they were having fun with. That was their shared joy, their shared secret together. So at the end of the day, I think we understand that kind of motivation. And again, that kind of motivation not unusual to teams. Yeah, so we're going to talk about the stolen pears because that's something of considerable value. All right. Any other first impressions here? All right. So what's happening in book 2 is this: Augustine is 16, and his his family's paying for a top education, and as often with a pricey education, money becomes a problem. So they basically he had to take a gap year essentially because they couldn't afford to pay the expensive tutors for him. And he does what a lot of teens would do with a year off. He wastes it. And he basically indicates that he spends his 16th year doing 2 things. One, hanging out with his adolescent friends, getting into mischief. And 2, trying to run up his sexual numbers by accomplishing sexual conquests. And these are sort of, to him, these are emblematic of his 16th year. I also draw your attention to the narrative structure I mentioned last week. I suggested that book 1 is largely about the creation in this case of Augustine specifically. Book 2 is about fallenness. So the 2 things that dominate book 2 are first his interest in his teenage sexual exploits, and second, his analysis of the theft of the pears. And both these things are supposed to be illustrative of Augustine's fallenness, much like Genesis chapter 3. So he's following this sort of distinctly Christian narrative structure, the idea of initial creation, fallenness, redemption, and the path to redemption is what takes up most of the narrative of the Confessions, and then restored blessedness. So that will be the fourth step. So what we look for in book 2 are sort of illustrations or metaphors or examples from Augustine's point of view of his fallenness. So that's by way of introduction. So he introduces in chapter 2 of book 2 the distinction between love and lust, roughly agape and eros, and somewhat lyrically, he says this: "What was there to bring me delight except to love and to be loved? But that due measure between soul and soul, wherein lie the bright boundaries of friendship, was not kept. Clouds arose from the slimy desires of the flesh, and from youth's seething spring. They clouded over and darkened my soul, so that I could not distinguish the calm light of chaste love from the fog of lust. Both kinds of affection burned confusedly within me and swept my feeble youth over the crags of desire, plunged me into a whirlpool of shame-filled deeds." So he talks about being 16 and having, on the one hand, a legitimate desire for companionship, camaraderie, friendship. On the Platonic model, which he locates in the soul. And the contrast is the tainted bodily desires. And of course, those can, in his mind, run together very well in teenage romantic sexual relationships. In the third paragraph of chapter 2, he does suggest that he would have been better off with an early teenage marriage. Who might have tempered my misery, turned to good use the fleeting beauties of those lowest things, and put limits to their delights, so that youth's flood might have spent itself on the shore of married life, if rest in such pleasures could not be gained by the end of begetting children, as your law, O Lord, prescribes. So, he says, life might have been easier for me if I'd married young, but his parents discouraged this and did nothing to make this happen. Why? Well, for the same reason we tell teens not to marry in our culture. That's going to be a problem. You're going to be, it's going to be a barrier to a successful career. You don't want children when you're young, and so forth. So instead, he focuses on sort of short-term sexual exploits. At the end of chapter 2, he says, "My parents took no care to save me by marriage from plunging into ruin. Their only care was that I should learn to make the finest orations and become a persuasive speaker." Let's see, what else should we say about this? It seems to me that Augustine, to some degree, in chapter 2, is engaging in this thing that religious people do sometimes, where there's a sense in which they exaggerate their own badness. So from the language of book 2, you might think Augustine was trying to compete with Magic Johnson, who supposedly, it was Magic Johnson, it was Will Chamberlain, who claims that he had slept with 10,000 women back in the 80s. Someone actually ran the math on that and said that's impossible. He would have had to have slept with 6 different women every day since the time he was like 14 or something. But from the language Augustine uses here, you might think that that's the kind of promiscuity that he was involved in. As far as you can tell, if you read between the lines, he had a handful of short-term sexual experiences, relationships. My guess is you could count them on one hand. And he even says he exaggerates in front of his friends, in sort of locker room style discussions where he tries to boast about higher numbers and conquests than he was actually involved in. So I think by 21st century standards, we would think of his actions here as kind of run of the mill. And then when we get to the next book or two, we'll see him very quickly get into a committed, long-term, live-in relationship, pretty close to a common law marriage for 9 years. So I'm going to say, if you're looking for somebody who is going to have a high quantitative account of number of partners or something, Augustine is probably not where we would find that. Instead, he's like the theft of the pairs. He is trying to go beyond the significance of the external actions, and what he's really concerned about is the significance of the internal heart behind the external actions. So that's a lot of what's going on. Thoughts or questions about Augustine's 16-year-old trysts?
It just kind of seems like his memories earlier that his mother, they kind of instructed him in spiritual matters. It seems sort of like a lot of people, once you go through confirmation, it's like, oh, you're fine, whatever. Like, you're good. We check the box. But I just kind of see that seems like doesn't happen.
Well, yeah, she basically says, yeah, just, don't commit adultery because A, I think that's actually illegal in this culture, and B, that's a good way to get yourself physically hurt. Jealous husbands are not. It's not in your best interest to get involved in that kind of situation. But beyond that, she kind of does this sort of weak sort of thing where, it doesn't work. She doesn't seem overly worried about it. In part because she's following this 4th century attitude where, that sin will get washed away when he's baptized later, because he's not baptized. And she thinks, in a certain sense, that's a good thing at this point. Other reactions? All right, well, starting in chapter 4, we get an account of these stolen pairs. And it's easy to miss what's really going on in the account of the stolen pairs. What Augustine is actually doing is he is finding something that he actually literally did in his teenage years, but he's going to use it to reimagine the activities of Genesis chapter 3. And if you look closely at the language here, he's going to write himself into the Adam and Eve story from Genesis chapter 3. So what happens here is this. He's going to tell a story about entering a forbidden garden and stealing fruits that he's not supposed to have against the law. Well, this is the Genesis 3 story, the story of Adam and Eve in the paradise garden, where there's only one thing they're not supposed to do. They're not supposed to eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So the reason why Augustine picks that particular event out of all the things he might have talked about in his teenage years is because that is the one that structurally comes closest to mirroring the story, the narrative of Genesis, the original fallenness of mankind. And this fits in very well with Augustine's theology, because he thinks, in a certain sense, as I discussed last week, the ancient way of thinking rejects individualism. So we're not just what we do, but in a certain sense, we literally participate in the actions collectively of our ancestors. So just as Adam ate the forbidden fruit, Augustine plays out sort of an extension of that by eating the forbidden fruit, forbidden pears in his own day. Now, what's really fun about this story is he tries to one-up the Genesis story. Let me see if I can find the spot where he does this. Essentially, he's going to argue that what he did was worse than the original sin. In chapter 6, he talks about the lack of beauty in the pears. And in contrast, if you read Genesis chapter 3, the fruit of the forbidden tree was actually good in itself. It just was forbidden. It was bad in the context of eating it at that particular time, under the condition of it being forbidden. And this is a common traditional Christian way of thinking about what goes wrong with sin. Generally, sin is the desire for something good, but outside of a good context for it. So that is generally the traditional theological account of what's going on with sin. It's not that we seize on to something that is worthless, but that we correctly see the good value of something, but we incorrectly overvalue it. But what Augustine, so that is often what is thought to have happened in Genesis chapter 3. What Augustine tries to argue, though, is that what he did was worse, because whereas the original forbidden fruit was something genuinely good, the forbidden fruit of Book 2 of Confessions wasn't particularly good and was inferior to good things that he had available to him. So he wants to say that original fallenness includes a certain kind of irrationality. Often, the irrationality has to do with putting lesser good things above better good things. But Augustine wants to take that one step farther and say maybe the forbidden fruit that he was interested in wasn't good at all. And for the idea of lesser versus greater goods, again, we can refer back to the Platonic divided line. The idea that material things are always less valuable than immaterial things. The least important things are just like shadows and reflections, images. Physical objects are more valuable than that and more stable than that, but less valuable than immaterial things. Immaterial things like mathematical and scientific theorems are sort of lower truths. You know, things like Pythagoras, things like things you learn in physics class. And then the best things are forms, virtue, justice, beauty, purity, friendship. And the best thing of all is God. And humanity has an uncomfortable place in this taxonomy of goods because we are an immaterial soul wed to a material body. Which is why the best kind of love is soul to soul. So this is why when you say you have platonic love for somebody, you're saying, it's all strictly non-physical. We're intellectual friends, we're comrades, but we're not involved in anything sexual, erotic, physical. So this is, this sort of idea, this Platonic idea is behind a lot of the language, lower things and greater things. You see this language, I believe, in book 2, chapters 2 and 3. Here, let me even read a quotation that draws upon this. So yeah, this is chapter 2, 3rd paragraph. Who might have tempered my misery and turned to good use the fleeting beauties of lowest things and put limits to their delights, so that youth flood might have spent itself on the shores of married life, if such pleasure could not be gained by the end of begetting children. So why is begetting children such a good thing? Because you're using physical pleasure to create something better, a human with a soul, that is another body-soul composite. So that is the best use of the physical erotic relationship and the interest in pleasure and such. Yeah. And you can see that language of lesser things, lowest things, higher things, better, greater goods, lower goods, repeatedly. We see it again in chapter 3 in paragraph 6. He talks about his father, the encounter, the discussion with his father in the bathhouse. Patrocles, it says, he rejoiced in intoxication, where in this world, from the unseen wine of its own perverse will, tending down towards lower things, forgets you, its creator, and loves your creature more than yourself. So again, we have that language of lower things. Lower things are always physical things. Upper things are always immaterial things. So loving created things more than the creator is, again, an example of this kind of irrationality. That being said, if you understand the Platonic structure, which Augustine is following, all of this is good. It's just degrees of goodness that are at stake. So it's not that physical things are bad, although I swear at times Augustine managed to make it sound as if he thinks that way. But in general, it's that they're just lesser than and less important than immaterial things. All right. Anything else I want to make sure we hit from the end of book 2?
I could add something to chapter 4.
Sure, please.
It seems as though from the end of chapter 2, or the beginning of chapter 2, he very specifically knows the difference between love and lust. But then in chapter 4, he has almost a whole paragraph devoted to how much we love evil and love sinning. And I think because I know that he is a smart guy, he specifically chose the word love for a reason. I don't know how many translations of love there are not, but
Yeah, there's at least 4.
he specifically used the word that he used for divine love to talk about how much he cared for sin.
Right. Yeah, well, I mean, it's to show that maybe love, a synonym for love might be strong desire. And if you have strong desire for something good, then it's love in that pure sense. And if you have strong desire for something that's sort of less than ideal, then that might trigger the use of the word lust, or maybe desire might be the best translation of it, just to keep it sort of value neutral. But yeah, a lot of the times, what is most defining of the self are what are the things you desire most. And it's not just the things you desire, but what's the order that you put them in. Because I think Augustine would say, yeah, he desires friendship and some of these other things, but are they more important to him than pleasure? In this context, probably not at this point. So if you read the conclusion to book 2, here is the conclusion that he thinks that he's illustrating book 2. I fell away from you, my God, and I went astray, too far astray from you, the support of my youth, and I became to myself a land of want. So this is why I describe book 2 as Augustine's account of his own fallenness. Is he describes this the stories of eating the forbidden fruit and the sexual exploits as examples of falling away. But on the other hand, according to his own theology, Augustine wasn't innocent before this. I mean, he had original sinfulness, but this is the first time that he is identifying sort of systemic, overt choices of his own as sort of his own expressions of that original sinfulness. I mean, because there's a sense, before you're a certain age, there is sort of limited moral culpability and worth behind your actions, because it's thought that you don't fully understand your actions, or you shouldn't be expected to fully understand your actions. Which is why we have, to this day, that's a principle at work in our criminal justice system. That's why, children's court is different than adult courts, and why you don't ever want to get charged as adults if you can avoid it. All right, anything else on book 2?
The invisible enemy is in chapter 3.
Probably
Is it original sin or the devil?
at risk of sounding like the church lady, I think it's
Satan has invaded our textbook.
let's see, which
8, paragraph 8.
paragraph?
Third line down, that I might cling even more firmly to its very navel, my invisible enemy.
Oh, that's interesting. See with what companions I ran about the streets of Babylon. Babylon is a traditional Christian metaphor for the foreign city. If you're familiar with Old Testament stories, much of the Jewish nation were literally slaves in Babylon, which was the empire which is now central where Iraq is, where they conquered the southern half of Israel. So the metaphor of Babylon is to be a kind of captive. So see with what companions I ran about the streets of Babylon, and how I wallowed in its mire as though in cinnamon and precious ointments, that I might cling even more firmly to its very navel. My invisible enemy crushed me underfoot, seduced me, for I was easy to seduce. The mother of my flesh, who had fled from the center of Babylon, but lingered in other parts of the city, just as she had warned me against unchastity, so also had some concern over what her husband had said about me, to restrain me from the bounds of married love, if it could not be cut back to quick, what she knew to be a present disease and a future danger. Yet she took no final care for this, because of fear that my prospects would be hindered by the impediments of life. So yeah, what does enemy refer to there? That's a good question. In context, I'm going to go, he's talking about lust and his own sinful nature rather than the devil, because there's nothing else anywhere in this book that specifically references the devil. But that's my guess. I'd be interested in reading some commentaries on Augustine to see which of the two people who thought about it way as much would suggest. Good question. Anything else? if you look at the second half of chapter 6, starting in chapter 13, you have a list of sort of vices and sort of a taxonomy of vices, which he says are sort of imitations of virtue. And again, you see a lot of this highest versus lowest Platonic language here. So he starts with pride. So pride imitates loftiness of mind while you are the one God, highest above all things. So again, we have that highest of all things language. Pride is an imitation. What does ambition seek? Against honor and glory. Now again, honor and glory are generous goods. Ambition, though, is a vice, sort of an inappropriate value in the pursuit of the genuine goods of honor and glory. The cruelty of the mighty desires to be feared, but who is to be feared except the one God? From his power, what can be seized and stolen away? And when or where or how or by whom? The caresses of the wanton call for love, but there is not more caressing than your charity, nor is anything to be loved more wholesomely than your truth, which is beautiful and bright above all things. So again, above all things, again, we have that high-low language there again. We have a comparison between charity, which medieval Christians often translate as love, or agape. So that is the genuine virtue, is charity or agape, or sort of pure love. And that's contrasted with wanton physical love. Curiosity pretends to be a desire for knowledge, while you know all things in the highest degree. So curiosity is a kind of shallow interest in knowledge. Ignorance itself and folly are cloaked over with the names of simplicity and innocence, because nothing more simple than you can be found. So again, ignorance and folly are intellectual vices. And there is almost an equivocation where they move from simplicity of mind to metaphysical simplicity, the claim that God is metaphysically simple, which means he's not constituted by multiple parts. That's interesting. What is more innocent than you, whereas to evil men their own works are hostile. Sloth seeks rest as it were, but what sure rest is there apart from the Lord. Sloth, the vice of sloth, is thought to be a failure. Sloth is not laziness. Sloth is an unwillingness to work against, is an unwillingness to labor sort of in the service of virtue. So it's not like you're not willing to work hard to make money. That's not what sloth is in this context. It's not a willingness to sort of fight the hard moral virtues against one's own self and desires. Luxury of life desires to be called plenty and abundance. You are the fullness and the unfailing plenty of incorruptible pleasure. Prodigality casts but the shadow of liberality, while you are the most affluent giver of all good things. That is a comparison between generosity, that's what liberality is, and prodigality is sort of wasteful spending of resources. Avarice, the desire to possess many things, and you possess all things. So again, what we have there is a taxonomy of traditional virtues and vices, where Augustine is explaining sort of what differentiates them for him, and there are many frequent references to God as the purest or best holder of the virtues. So again, this goes to his skill as a rhetorician to systemically go through something like that. That's structurally interesting. All right, well, here's what we're going to do for next time. I'm going to send around some more readings online, and we will read those for next time. Those will be some background readings. We'll review the Genesis passage on the forbidden fruits, to reacquaint us with that a little bit, so we can talk about that a little bit more. Maybe I'll have some historical documents about Caitlin. I forget everything that's in this next package, but I'll upload it to the reading section of Scholar, and we'll proceed from there. All right. So read in advance of next time. Come prepared to discuss, and don't lose track of your reading summaries. March will be here before we know it. You need to do it with 5 before spring break. Thank you very much.
I have the group discussion Friday.
Oh, good, excellent.
So, is there stuff on the syllabus is there any general structure I need to follow?
I mean, the most important rule is that me and you have to have a talk about it.
Okay.
Like last time, I thought it was well done. In that it was sort of open-ended discussion oriented. That's what I didn't want. You need some sort of a handout so that people can follow along. Usually the handout includes some questions as well as some comparative text. That's one of the more common sorts of discussions to say, this topic in Augustine seems similar to, or we want to compare it to something else from outside of the class.
Okay.
Yeah, so that's what you need to work on. And then, we can have like a video call on Thursday.
Okay.
And I want you to send me a rough draft of your handout, by Wednesday night or Thursday afternoon. I want to be able to give you some feedback and you have time to tweak it and then get it back to me so I can get it to everyone. Awesome. That makes sense?
Yes.
Excellent. I'm glad that you took this week. I last time I checked, nobody had signed up for it.
Yes.
So that'll be good. I think book 2's a lot of fun. I think, there's a lot there to analyze. One thing to sort of investigate would be sort of accounts of human nature. Because, this is really getting into that human sinfulness doctrine, which everyone always seems offended by, but nobody ever seems to reject the idea that humans are flawed. So it's one of those things I've always found sort of funny to hear the way people do. People are very angry that Augustine espouses original sinfulness, but they completely agree that humans are systematically morally flawed. So it's hard to see, what's everybody's beef.
Yeah. Yeah, that is so.
You should turn your seat around.
Oh.
I think probably, as I said last time, it's not that so much that they deny that people are systematically morally flawed. They just don't like the idea that, there's some sort of eternal consequence for that.
Right.
All right, why is the screen off?
Always has to go wrong.
Oh, there we go. I just need to log out of YouTube.
Gotcha.
Otherwise, I'll be spying on this room all day.
All right. You have a good afternoon.
Thank you.